Hey everybody, welcome to Red May. Sorry we got a late start this morning. Before we get to the Freedom panel, I want to clue you in to what's coming up for the next weekend, because we are down to our last 5 of 27 events in the month. Today at 3 p.m., we have What Was Neoliberalism with Sarah Bruyette, Nikhil Pal Singh, Joshua Clover, and Jamie Merchant. Tomorrow, Saturday at 11 a.m., Uno Koza's Theory of Crisis Today. Richard Westra, Ken Kawashima, Wendy Matsumura, and Gavin Walker. On Sunday at 11 a.m., There's No Such Thing as the Economy. Samuel Chambers, Cordelia Belton, Edward, and Soren Mao. And on Monday at 11 a.m., we collaborate with Spectre Journal to partner on a panel on Ukraine, imperialism, and the world economy. That includes Ilya Matveev, Rebecca Carl, David McNally, and hopefully broadcasting from Ukraine, Yulia Yurchenko, author of Ukraine and World and Capital Ukraine. I forget the exact name of the book. It's great. It's from Pluto Press. Anyway, that's what we got. We also have a movie on Tuesday night, Electra My Love by Miklos Yancho, if you happen to be in Seattle at the Beacon Theater at 7:30 p.m. So without further ado, before we go to Lake Stowe, wait, I got to do a pitch for money before we go in. If you like what we do, want to see it happen next year, which will be our 7th year in a row, which is really amazing when you think of a communist festival being produced in America for so long. We need your help. We need money. We don't get institutional support. Go to www.redmayseattle.org and press the donate button. It'll give you either our Patreon or our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May. Be generous. We need you. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce you to the host of today's event on freedom, my Seattle neighbor, Michael Hardt, who teaches at Duke University. He's the co-author with Antonio Negri of the trilogy Empire, Commonwealth, Multitude, also Assembly, many books, including a great book on Deleuze. Hi, Michael. Welcome back to Red May.
Thanks, Philip. And
you're muted.
I'm muted. Let me figure that out. I should be unmuted, but I'm still muted. Oh, you can hear me. Okay, good. Here we go. So yes, I'm Michael Hardt. I'm as moderator of this session. One notice before we started, it was advertised, and we were expecting till quite recently that that Martin Hägglund would be participating in the event, but at the last minute, due to other events, he isn't able to participate with us. So the discussion we have here will start with Leah Ypi, who teaches in the Department of Government at LSE in London, and Vanessa Wills, who teaches in the Philosophy Department at George Washington. And so Leah will begin, and then we'll turn to Vanessa, and then I have prepared organizing discussion. If those watching live do have questions or comments to animate the discussion, please forward those, and I'll work them into the discussion for today. Okay, so yes, Leah first, as I mentioned, she's in the Department of Government at LSE. She has recently published The Architectonic of Reason in 2022. She's co-editor, co-author of 2 other books, and also of Free, which has just come out also in 2022, about which I think Leah will begin the discussion today. So I'll pass it to you, Leah.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for having me in the panel. So I'm going to talk about freedom in socialism and in capitalism and about my book, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, which is a slightly unusual way of writing and talking about freedom. It's an autobiographical book. It's a coming of age story that talks about a little girl who grows up in communist Albania, convinced that she lives in the freest country in the world. And then a year after the Berlin Wall, the end of communism arrives to her country, and she also discovers at that point that the world that she thought was a free world was not so free after all, and especially that her family, whom she thought were always committed communists, are dissidents who have been hiding from her the history of their family and how they felt about communism throughout their lives. And so it's a coming of age story which talks about freedom as an ideal, as a delusion, as a set of ideological slogans, as a promise, as a betrayal, and does it by talking about how freedom looks like in socialist societies, how it's promised, but also how it was delivered in real world socialist states, and then in the transition to liberal capitalism and the costs of that freedom. Now, rather than explaining what the argument about freedom is in the book, I'm going to read from the epilogue, in which which is the very end of the book, in which I talk about my contemporary take on freedom and how I got to the views on freedom that I hold now, and why I think freedom is a concept central to both liberal and socialist tradition, something that socialism develops rather than rejecting from that tradition. And so I'm going to read from the epilogue, where I explain how this particular story of growing up in Albania under communism and then having lived through the transition took me to where I am teaching Marx and having this particular conception of freedom. So I'm going to read the epilogue, which starts like this. Each year, I begin my Marx courses at the London School of Economics by telling students that many people think of socialism as a theory of material relations, class struggle, or economic justice, but that in reality, something more fundamental animates it. Socialism, I tell them, is above all a theory of human freedom, of how to think about progress in history, of how we adapt to circumstances, but also try to rise above them. Freedom is not sacrificed only when others tell us what to say, where to go, how to behave. A society that claims to enable people to realize their potential, but fails to change the structures that prevent everyone from flourishing, is also oppressive. And yet, despite all the constraints, we never lose our inner freedom, the freedom to do what is right. My father and my grandmother did not live to see what became of my studies. After quitting his career as a politician, my father was thrust from one private employer to another, each time blaming the dismissal on his poor English and increasingly his rudimentary computer skills. To facilitate his job searches, the family moved to a flat in the capital close to the old botanical gardens, now one of the most polluted areas in the country. His asthma deteriorated. One summer evening, shortly after his 60th birthday, he had a violent asthma attack. He rushed to the window and opened it to breathe, but was wrapped in a cloud of carbon monoxide and dust. My mother was in Italy when my father died. My parents had reconciled, but she worked there seasonally as a carer or cleaner to help offset some of our new debts, while her siblings in Albania chased their old confiscated properties. Those efforts, which my grandmother had always deemed a waste of time, came to fruition a few months after her death, following that of my father. A large chunk of coastal land was sold to an Arab property developer, and our fortunes changed overnight. I no longer needed to count my last pennies until the next scholarship installment. I could enjoy meals out and drink late in bars, discussing politics with my new university friends. Many of those friends were self-declared socialists, Western socialists, that is. They spoke about Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, Salvador Allende, or Ernesto Che Guevara as secular saints. It occurred to me that they were like my father in this respect. The only revolutionaries they considered worthy of admiration had been murdered. These icons showed up on posters, t-shirts, and coffee cups, much like the way photos of Enver Hoxha, our old socialist leader, would show up in people's living rooms when I was growing up. When I pointed this out, my friends wanted to know more about my country. But they did not think that my stories from the 80s were in any way significant to their political beliefs. Sometimes, my appropriating the label of socialist to describe both my experiences and their commitments was considered a dangerous provocation. We used to go to a large open-air concert in Rome for 1st May, and I could not help but reminisce about the parades of my childhood on Workers' Day. What you had was not really socialism, they would say, barely concealing their irritation. My stories about socialism in Albania and references to all the other socialist countries against which our socialism had measured itself were at best tolerated as the embarrassing remarks of a foreigner still learning to integrate. The Soviet Union, China, the German Democratic Republic, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Cuba, there was nothing socialist about them either. They were seen as the deserving losers of a historical battle that the real, authentic bearers of that title had yet to join. My friend's socialism was clear, bright, and in the future. Mine was messy, bloody, and of the past. And yet, the future that they sought, and that which socialist states had once embodied, found inspiration in the same books, the same critiques of society, the same historical characters. But to my surprise, they treated this as an unfortunate coincidence. Everything that went wrong on my side of the world could be explained by the cruelty of our leaders or the uniquely backward nature of our institutions. They believed there was little for them to learn. There was no risk of repeating the same mistakes, no reason to ponder what had been achieved and why it had been destroyed. Their socialism was characterized by the triumph of freedom and justice, mine by their failure. Their socialism would be brought about by the right people, with the right motives, under the right circumstances, with the right combination of theory and practice. There was only one thing to do about mine: forget it. But I was reluctant to forget. It's not that I felt nostalgic. It's not that I romanticized my childhood. It's not that the concepts I had grown up with were so deeply rooted in me that it was impossible to disentangle myself. But if there was one lesson to take away from the history of my family and of my country, it was that people never make history under circumstances they choose. It is easy to say what you had was not the real thing, applying that to socialism or liberalism, to any complex hybrid of ideas and reality. It releases us from the burden of responsibility. We are no longer complicit in moral tragedies created in the name of great ideas, and we don't have to reflect, apologize, and learn. We're doing a reading group on Das Kapital, a friend told me one day. If you join it, you will learn about real socialism. So I did. When I read the opening pages on the preface, it felt a bit like hearing French, a foreign language I had been taught as a child but rarely practiced. I remembered many of the key words: capitalists, workers, landlords, value, profit, and they echoed inside my head in the voice and simplified formulations of my elementary school teacher, Nora, adapted for school children. Individuals, Marx wrote in the opening pages, are dealt with only insofar as they are the personifications of economic categories, embodiments of particular class relations and class interests. But for me, behind every personification of an economic category, there was the flesh and blood of a real person. Behind the capitalist and the landlord, there were my great-grandfathers. Behind the workers, there were the Roma who worked at the port. Behind the peasants, the people with whom my grandmother was sent to work in the fields when my grandfather went to prison, and about whom she spoke condescendingly. It was impossible to finish reading and just move on. My mother finds it difficult to understand why I teach and research Marx, why I write about the dictatorship of the proletariat. She sometimes reads my articles and finds them baffling. She has learned to weather awkward questions from relatives. Do I really believe these ideas are convincing or feasible? How is it possible? Mostly, she keeps her criticisms to herself. Only once did she draw attention to a cousin's remarks that my grandfather did not spend 15 years locked up in prison so that I would leave Albania to defend socialism. We both laughed awkwardly, then paused and changed the topic. It left me feeling like someone who is involved in murder, as if the mere association with the ideas of a system that destroyed so many lives in my family were enough to make me the person responsible for pulling the trigger. Deep down, I knew this was what she thought. I always wanted to clarify, but didn't know where to start. I thought that it would take a book to answer. This is that book. At first, it was going to be a philosophical book about the overlapping ideas of freedom in the liberal and socialist traditions. But when I started writing, just like when I started reading Das Kapital, ideas turned into people. The people who made me who I am. They loved and fought each other. They had different conceptions of themselves and of their obligations to other people. They were, as Marx writes, the product of social relations for which they were not responsible, but they still tried to rise above them. They thought they'd succeeded. But when their aspirations became reality, their dreams turned into my disillusionment. We lived in the same place, but in different worlds. These worlds overlapped only briefly, and when they did, we saw things through different eyes. My family equated socialism with denial, the denial of who they wanted to be, of the right to make mistakes and learn from them, to explore the world on one's own terms. I equated liberalism with broken promises, the destruction of solidarity, the right to inherit privilege, turning a blind eye to injustice. In some ways, I have gone full circle. When you see a system change once, it's not that difficult to believe that it can change again. Fighting cynicism and political apathy turns into what some might call a moral duty. To me, it's more of a debt that I feel I owe to all the people of the past who sacrificed everything because they were not apathetic. They were not cynical. They did not believe that things fall into place if you just let them take their course. If I do nothing, their efforts will have been wasted. Their lives will have been meaningless. My world is as far from freedom as the one my parents tried to escape. Both fall short of that ideal, but their failures took distinctive forms, and without being able to understand them, we will remain forever divided. I wrote my story to explain, to reconcile, and to continue the struggle. So this is the epilogue, and this is where my book ends. And I guess the question where I have ended up in my research as well is about how to think about freedom in the aftermath of the fall of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War and the fall of real world socialism, and a way of approaching freedom as a socialist with those failures behind our shoulders. And I guess the version of socialism that I have ended up with is one where you have to be aware of the constraints of history. And so this idea of Marx that kind of keeps coming up in the epilogue, which is that we never make history under circumstances that we choose, but to which Rosa Luxemburg adds, but we make history nevertheless. And the question for me is what can be rescued and how should one approach this history of socialism and the kind of real world institutions and the real world constraints on freedom that there were under socialism. But also, how can we approach that history in a way that is not just a history of denial and rejection, but something from which we can learn in developing socialism for the future, and how central the idea of freedom is to that version of socialist future. So that's where I'll just end up, and then we can carry on discussing afterwards.
There, terrific. That's great. And so now we turn to Vanessa. As I mentioned, Vanessa Wills is in the philosophy department at George Washington, and her forthcoming book in 2023 from Oxford University Press is titled Marx's Ethical Vision. Vanessa.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. So there's a few things I want to do in my time. First of all, just kind of say a bit about the personal and political and social context at this moment. So I'm here in the United States. I'm in Washington, D.C., and this week have been closely following a sort of torrent of disturbing details to emerge from Uvalde, a small town in southern Texas, relatively near the border with Mexico. Where there was a school shooting, 19 small children murdered. And we're learning a bit every hour, really, about the various catastrophic failures, miscalculations, examples of sheer cowardice on the part of the local police, who we now know stood by for an hour, hearing gunshots and not following their own protocol to save these children. And, there's lots to reflect on. One piece that's anyway relevant for us here and for what I'm about to talk about is, we are often called upon to put things out of our minds so that we can be productive, so that we can just function in a extremely destructive, inhumane set of conditions. And this is a week where I'm less successful at that compartmentalization than usual. It's just a incredible outrage that is very difficult to accept, that we ought not accept. So with that being said, I want to use my time to start with some relatively abstract theoretical reflections on the concept of freedom in Marx's writings, in Marxist theory, and bring that into connection with some ongoing long-term social crises that have been unfolding in slow motion for a long time, especially in the US, and relate that to a way into thinking about the status of the U.S. population and then its relationship to the rest of the world, right? The relationship of working people, poor and working people in the U.S. to poor and working people worldwide. So I'm going to say a word that sometimes when we try to understand and explain Marxism, we try to run away from. That word is dialectics. But I promise I'm going to bring this down to a more concrete level. So if we're going to understand the concept of freedom for Marx's thought, or for any attempt to theorize and understand the world applying a Marxist method, then we have to think about that concept dialectically, and specifically what this means for us and for what I'm about to outline here is we have to think about the ways that freedom in practice ends up being realized in a way that from which its opposite, unfreedom, emerges, right? So we can think of freedom and unfreedom, or freedom and subjection, as conceptual opposites, and as pure abstract concepts, we can think about them separately, right? But in practice, they interpenetrate, right? Where certain kinds of freedoms exist and unfold, we find also that they directly give rise to unfreedoms. Marx talks about this, especially in the context of what we might call a kind of bourgeois freedom, right? Capitalist freedom, the freedom of the ruling class to have those conditions which are conducive towards the satisfaction of their conditions of success, conditions of flourishing. The ruling class, the capitalist class, is able to impose upon the rest of society those conditions in which it flourishes as a class, right? In which it is able to realize its aims, and its aims, of course, are the accumulation of profit. Oftentimes that's directly at odds with human aims, with the aims of people living in society, which is an aim to survive, hopefully to survive in conditions that allow human beings to enjoy their lives, to enjoy various kinds of creation, to find themselves confirmed and realized in their productive activity. These things are very much at odds with the freedom of capitalist exchange, with the freedom to conduct business in a way that is insulated from the interference of the masses, of the public. And this is useful to think about when we think about various ways of conceptualizing an apparent opposition between the interests of the individual and the interests of society, something that comes up quite a lot when we think about liberal theory. And in that opposition of the individual and society, and here it's usually the capitalist individual and society, we see an echoing, right, of this notion that one side of this is a site of freedom, and the other, society, social control, the needs of society, the interests of society, in at times limiting the kinds of unrestrained freedom that capitalist individuals can participate in, right? Society is then associated with unfreedom, subjection, right? A kind of threat to the totally free activity of an individual agent. And I think we see that in lots of ways in the United States, and is, of course, given the preface, the context that I offered a moment ago, one way I'm thinking about this is in relationship to the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which grants the right to bear arms. And of course, there's a great deal of contestation, right, about what that right actually endeavors to guarantee, but I'll leave that to the side. Maybe we can think about it in the Q&A. So in the United States, you would think that given the incredible free reign of gun manufacturers, of gun sellers, and of individuals, right, to buy and sell firearms, to carry them openly, to carry them to acquire them with very little state interference whatsoever. You would think that given that the U.S. compared to other countries that are most similar to it, right? You would think the fact that the U.S. has these absolutely unique, right, completely free play when it comes to the acquisition and carrying of firearms, you would think, given that it's a quote unquote democratic country, that this reflects a great passion on the part of its populace for weaponry and for having as much weaponry as freely available as possible, and for having as little social interference in individuals' freedom, so-called, to carry arms. But that's not the case. Gun control is actually extremely popular as a policy in the US. So looking at very recent polls, in 2021, a Gallup poll found 52% of Americans want stricter gun control. And when we look at recent polls just in the past year, in some cases just in the past week, that's very consistent. Anywhere between 52 and 59% of Americans do not support the conditions that we have. And so it means that one of the ways, well, this alone doesn't mean it, but this gives us some reason to entertain, in any case, the possibility that what looks like the political freedom of people in the United States to affect the conditions in which they live, especially something as vital as taking steps to limit the brutal slaughter of their children. This gives us the fact that this is not something that is immediately politically feasible in the US, that when we talk about it, we have to talk about it in terms of a massive social movement intervening into the current state of things is what will be necessary to change this. It gives us some reason to question, right? What is the content of political freedom for citizens of the United States? And it means it suggests that one important lens among others to think about the real situation of people living in the United States is as a subject population. So we're familiar with this, of course, in all kinds of contexts, right? When we think, for example, about the state of people of color in the United States, this ought to be a very familiar lens for thinking about these questions, right? And thinking about the relationship between freedom as it's conceptualized and guaranteed in theory, and then what this kind of freedom actually looks like in practice. In Uvalde, the town that we're learning, the town that we're still learning the complete depth and contours of the tragedy and the compounded crimes that occurred there. The police get 40% of the town's annual budget. Right. And of course, we know that in spring 2020, we had a massive uprising of activism in the United States, oriented around the demand that Black Lives Matter, the demand and the statement, right? Both a descriptive and an imperative that Black Lives Matter. And one of the demands of that movement was defunding the police, right? And instead, that has not happened, right? Of course. And we have police with these massive bloated budgets at the same time that famously our schools are incredibly underfunded. So one of the things, many of you watching have probably had this experience. One thing that is always jarring in a way is to find oneself in conversations with people from various countries around the world, especially as a US resident, and to find the stark separation between what US Americans regard as absolutely normal and what people in other countries, especially similarly wealthy countries, regard as unthinkable, right? That is shocking to them. I was recently in a conversation of this sort with a person from Europe who said, "What do you mean teachers purchase their own school supplies?" But of course, in the US, polls show that teachers on average spend about $1,000 a year, $750 to $1,000 a year on purchasing supplies for their own room. So these teachers that were in this school, they had purchased the supplies, right, for their own students, most likely, to help and educate them. Meanwhile, they, when they needed help, the police, who were incredibly well-funded, incredibly well-armed, there's a SWAT team for the small town of Uvalde, did nothing, right? There's a passage that from Marx that I particularly wanted to read today as part of my remarks. And it's one of the places where Marx is trying to help us to understand the dialectical, and in this case, I mean the inner contradiction, right, of the concept of freedom, and the way that we have to think about these freedom or freedoms, right, in terms of their practical expression, and that when we do look at them in their practical expression, we're then led to understand the way that they play out, right, in a way that guarantees their very negation and opposite. And Marx writes this in The Civil War in France. He says, "The civilization and justice of bourgeois order comes out in its lurid light whenever the slaves and drudges of that order rise against their masters. Then this civilization and justice stand forth as undisguised savagery and lawless revenge." And we see this again and again, globally, of course, not just in the United States. It's one of the things that is, I think, the most difficult to help people to understand and to incorporate into their theory of the world that they're experiencing, right? The extent to which people in the US are propagandized, the extent to which what we have is often not best thought of as a lack of the freedoms that are spelled out and guaranteed in our documents, our Constitution, in social studies class, when you're a kid growing up. Oftentimes, instead of thinking about this as a lack of those freedoms or the deprivation of those freedoms, oftentimes what we're getting is, in fact, what it really means to have a society that expresses in as exaggerated and highly developed a way the internal contradictions and the hypocrisy and the inner rottenness, right, of a system and of a set of ideals that inherently can think of the interests of society, think of public interests as a kind of unjust intrusion on the free play of the rulers. I think, I'm going to wrap up here, but I think that this is something we don't talk enough about, and I think, and I hope, I guess, that it can be a key to thinking about the ways that people living and working in the United States ought not to think of themselves as sharing interests with the rulers of the US. We have much more in common with people around the world who are being deprived of their freedom by our rulers, by our politicians. And that we have to understand. Failing to understand it will not only make us ineffective in being in solidarity with people around the world, but it's completely antithetical to us being able to properly understand our own position within the US and what is necessary in order to achieve real liberation, in order to emancipate ourselves and be free in a way that captures the aspirations of everyday working people to live good lives. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Vanessa. That's great. And I have several things that I want to talk about, but let me try one that I'm hoping that could bring together some of the things that both Leah and Vanessa presented, even though, of course, as everyone can see, we're dealing with different geographical and historical locations. I wanted to start, though, with a question about maybe call it the contradictions of freedom that you both are presenting, or the limitations. I'm not sure exactly the right way to think of it. And one of the things, of course, to do is correct me when I mischaracterized or misunderstood what's going on. It seems to me that one of the things fundamental with what Leah is working with is the boundaries between freedom and necessity. I mean, Leah, you come back several times in the book, and you do in that epilogue to the quote from the 18th Brumaire about that people make history, but not under circumstances of their own choosing. And I think that's one way for you to discuss. It's not exactly, it seems to me, not exactly the dialectic that Vanessa is working with, but the way of understanding freedom in different social and national contexts. Like I'm very interested, for instance, that your presentation of Albania is very different from at least what I've understood of German notions of Ostalgie, like of the nostalgia for the East. But on the other hand, you of course want to recognize and appreciate the accomplishments within a certain historical circumstance. So I guess what I'm trying to work through is, what vision of freedom do we have when recognizing the limitations of the circumstances in which we accomplish it? And I guess one of the things that I would be interested to hear what you say, Leah, about is the how one overcomes the ideological pressures of thinking freedom in terms of individualism, which I think that Vanessa, that's one way of connecting the two. Okay. Yeah, I mean, also the other thing we have to develop, I think, Leah, especially from the way you put it in the epilogue, is the internal bifurcation that you're recognizing with yourself of the way that socialism had been thought in the socialist regimes, Albania, first of all, and the European and US, or European and North American conceptions of socialism that's going along with this, which anyway, it seems like an opportunity for that. But mostly it's about, I'm thinking about the freedom thing, because with Vanessa, I think it's quite different with the dialectic that you're thinking. And in fact, primarily it seemed to me, Vanessa, what you were arguing for is to recognize to unveil the false notion of freedom that bourgeois ideology has inculcated in us. I mean, I think the passage that came to mind for me while you were first talking was the one at the end of chapter 6 in volume 1, where Marx is saying, for the perspective of the market, from what he's talked about so far about commodity exchange, this is the Eden of freedom, equality, Bentham, and there's a fourth one I can't remember. But there it is clearly a bourgeois notion of freedom and of equality that he wants to mock, or, well, if not mock, at least undermine, because of the individual commodity owners who come to the market, and they're free insofar as they can exchange their commodities. But of course, he's showing quite quickly that to undermine that notion of freedom because they're constrained to sell their labor power, blah, blah. I mean, and the passage you point to in the Civil War in France, it's different. It's more of a political version rather than the economic conceptual one. But it's similarly about the rottenness of bourgeois civilization that comes to the core once it's threatened. And that I think what you're getting at is that the freedom that we have to unburden ourselves of the ideological notion of freedom that we've been fed, or that we and in order to recognize the different freedom, but still in both of what you've presented so far, and I know that you both have ideas about this, and this is what is then that freedom once we conduct the conceptual operations that both of you are proposing, which seem to me exactly right. I still want then the characterization of what that of what the notion of freedom that we're left with is, or the possible freedom that we're left with is, and how one would characterize that. I think the last part I asked is too hard, but I mean, or I'm not sure what I would say. That's when I judge something is too hard. You guys are probably better at me than this. So, but sorry, I think I've given you enough. I hope it's concrete enough to begin. In fact, Leah, why don't you begin just as a, it'd be nice to go back and forth too, because I think even though what you're both working on are quite different, I can recognize, and I hope we can bring out a way that they speak to each other clearly. Yeah, Leah.
Unmuting. Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, I think I wanted to go back to this, maybe to link a bit your question about the kind of recognition of the inner contradictions of freedom, as you put it, with what Vanessa started with, which is what dialectic is in a way, where in a way dialectic is exactly the recognition of these contradictions, but with this idea of a motion and of a movement going forward, where the recognition of the contradictions serves as a springboard for developing ideas better, but also for understanding historical circumstances better. And so I think so one of the things that comes up when in this, Marxian saying that freedom is the consciousness of necessity, that I also try to grapple with in my book, and how is it, what kind of vision of freedom do we have when we recognize what, as you said, this kind of limitation of circumstances? The way, I think this is something that the Marxian tradition generally really struggles to hold together, because there is an element of agency and of will, and something that is not reducible to circumstances, which in some ways gives the emancipatory push and the aspiration to a collective movement on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you have the recognition of the importance of history and of the fact that no idea is ever completely disembedded. No set of imperatives is ever completely detached from the institutions that realize that set of imperatives. And so I find that the way I have tried to reconcile this is by developing a kind of version of what I call Kantian Marxism, which is basically, which kind of explicitly brings out the element of will, the element of freedom, and where freedom is basically a sense of moral responsibility about being a human agent, namely someone who has reason, someone who thinks of other people as ends in themselves in the kind of Kantian moral theory, and who also always thinks not just of the individual, but as the human being, as an agent embedded in particular social relations. And where this kind of moral imperative of being in moral social relations gives you then the foundation for a critique of society that is not limited to a critique of a particular context, but that tries to take the whole world into its kind of sphere of concern in a way. So that's the kind of Kantian element. It's basically, there is a cosmopolitanism in the sense of the whole world is your unit of concern, and a very deep humanism in the sense in which reason is the central element there. And there's and the awareness of freedom comes through this awareness of kind of reason as distinguishing human beings from other species, which is also very important in the early Marx, for example, when he talks about alienation as the estrangement of the worker from the real human being, from his human essence. It's also something that I think Vanessa was bringing out when she was talking about this tension between the capitalist class and a capitalist class that basically creates the structures of unfreedom that basically make people unable to see themselves as members of the human species, but always forces them into particular categories. And some of these categories are exclusive and others are oppressive. But basically, it's about recognizing the divorce between the human being as a member of the human species, which has these kind of moral concerns, and the human being as an occupant of a particular social role, like the capitalist or the working class and so on. And from that, in this kind of divorce, generating the critical insight that is necessary to criticize the circumstances. So basically, that's all, I think, where I end up theoretically. A lot of Marxists obviously have problems with that, because in some ways, I guess the more materialist aspect of the theory is not as much emphasized in that story. It's a more of a kind of Kantian Hegelian story that then uses the Marxist tradition as a way of understanding why is it that, the modern society didn't actually realize, didn't institutionalize the freedom that it promised in its institutions, but where Marx is almost like an appendix to Hegel. And it's only if you kind of read these three authors together that you understand how is it that we can keep together this tradition of both understanding the centrality of human agency and the centrality of human will and of freedom in history on the one hand, but also the fact that freedom always needs to be institutionalized, to be kind of real, to be, it needs to be rights and it needs to be a set of obligations, and it's always realized in a specific context. And from there, I think, is a way of so this brings together, as I say, this kind of more Kantian element, which is about the foundations of freedom, and this more Hegelian element, which is about the institutional conditions in which freedom is realized, and then the Marxian element that points out why is it that the modern state is incapable of satisfying this demand for freedom that its subjects make by talking about the constraints that the capitalist system poses to the state. And I think that's connected then to your last question in a way, which is about the way in which socialism is understood and reflected when socialists in the West kind of think about socialism, which was my target almost in my epilogue, which is this very abstract way in the end of thinking about socialism. Because if we take seriously this historical dialectic, if we take seriously the idea that ideas in history are never just ideas, they always become institutional reality, then the particular concerns of the place and the specific historical circumstances will make a crucial difference to how these ideas are delivered. But the worry is that the tendency is that whenever we approach non-liberal contexts or liberals that are kind of outside of the historical center, the historical kind of center of concern in a way, which is mainstream liberal countries, then you always have this more paternalistic or more exoticizing way in which, instead of engaging and thinking about the history of these places and thinking about the tradition and the institutions and the lack of institutions in a way in which these ideas were realized, you think, oh, it's because, they're backwards, or they don't really understand, or they're totalitarian, or they have this kind of authoritarian figures that can't do away without the authoritarian personality, which is in a way a very orientalizing way of reading history outside the kind of core liberal center. And I'm sure something of this will also resonate with minorities within core Western countries. So it's an attitude that they have to people and states outside the core area of concern, but also I think an attitude that they have to minorities within the state, where, again, because these histories are not sufficiently represented and not sufficiently considered and engaged with in detail, so I guess this is a way of connecting to what Vanessa was saying, then they're not really seen as sources of learning, but just as something that gets kind of excluded from the way in which the stories are told.
Can I, Vanessa, before you come in, Vanessa, I wanted to ask a specific question to Leah, that just to keep the continuity of it. I understand well, and it seems right and great to me, your critique of the way that Western European Marxists misunderstand the conditions of the socialist projects but what I don't get yet from the epilogue or from what you just said, maybe just because I'm not quite getting it right, is I think you have a coordinated critique of their proposals, and I'm not really sure who the Western Marxists are at this point, of freedom or of socialism. I think that's part of what you're saying, and that's the part I don't get, and I guess maybe I'm also not quite sure who you mean by that. And should I be implicated in it, by the way? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the target is very general. It's more about really the attitude to the Cold War and what can we learn from the Cold War in terms of taking forward socialism as a project. It seems to me that the legacy of the Cold War is just not part of the kind of Western Marxist way of thinking about future socialism. The fact that there is this, in a way, historical defeat of socialism. It's as though, if they didn't get it right and it was all wrong and it was just socialism in name and they didn't mean that, and so you kind of exclude it as something that is irrelevant to you, or you appropriate it in this very nostalgic way that doesn't actually in the end grapple with the real concerns of these societies. And I suspect the reason for that, I mean, it's not just kind of random and arbitrary. The reason for that is, I think, a gap in the Marxist tradition of just thinking about the theory of the state. So it seems to me that a lot of Marxists, not all of them, but many of them, have spilled a lot of ink and spent lots of resources in defending Marxism as an economic theory and thinking about socialism as an economic alternative to capitalism. But I think not enough in thinking about what version of democracy it entails, at how it engages with the state, at how it engages with the rule of law, with rights, with concepts of obligation, and in what position does it stand to the liberal tradition on that front. I think of a lot of the failure of the state socialist projects wasn't just to do with the collapse of planned economies. I think a lot of the failure was to do with the lack of democracy, because there was a sense of kind of neglect for this, what was considered a kind of overly liberal or sort of worry about like abstract rights and the rule of law and the kind of guarantees to freedom of movement and freedom of speech. And in part to do with the ideological critique, because there's obviously a very robust Marxist critique of liberal ideology, which shows you that, in the end, this is only the freedom of some and not of others, and that, all of our concepts of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of association, in the end, only work for the ruling elites in a way. They don't work for everyone. But I worry that there we kind of throw away the baby with the bathwater. And there's something about that tradition that needs to be defended, that liberal tradition about the state, about the law, about the system of rights, that need to be defended very, very strongly, and also to be taken very seriously in its failures when you think about how to develop an alternative project that kind of, in a way, tries to learn from the failures of the past, rather than just saying, oh, it's something that, doesn't concern us because it was the Soviets, it was the Albanians, it was the Chinese, it was, whoever tried to get this, to get this project going from an institutional perspective. And so that's what I'm trying to recover and to hold on to. On the one hand, this idea of, yes, there is historical necessity and there's constraints and there's contingent historical reasons for why these societies failed, namely that they didn't have a liberal public sphere and they didn't really have a strong sense of the state, and they were all semi-feudal societies as they were engaging with the socialist project. But a lot of it, I think, to do also with a gap in Marxist theory when it comes to thinking about politics and what is a specific radical democratic project that Marxists have when they develop their alternative.
I think, let me try translating it a little bit into my own understanding of it, which would be, because one of the things that you're pointing towards, indirectly at least, is the way Marxists in the dominant capitalist countries were pressured during the Cold War. It was either so a lot of the Marxist tradition, even the so-called Western Marxist tradition, had to separate itself from Soviet orthodoxy, etc. Because of not and emphasize that critique of it. Like you were either that line, or you were against that line. And I think what you're pointing towards, which seems to me absolutely necessary, is a more nuanced appreciation and critique of the existing socialist regimes. That there's a lot to learn from them without embracing them wholly, which seems to me, that seems exactly right. But it's not a mystery to me that Marxists in the dominant countries, at least the ones, I'm the oldest of the three of us by far, and even it's really the ones older than me that I think had that that pressure, and the Cold War had a certain kind of effect. Okay, I'm sorry to distract Vanessa the things, because in some ways Leah was posing things directly to you. I just wanted to jump in and clarify, and I do understand better now these points about the Cold War. Vanessa, is it okay for you to jump in now?
Okay, so I'll speak mainly to the question, what do I see as the positive conception of freedom? So I'll start by saying a bit about how I think about freedom and necessities, and that was part of your question as well, Michael. So I think that, so of course there's been multiple attempts over the years to attempt to spell out what exactly the relationship is between freedom and necessity in Marx, and it's of special importance and centrality for Marx, because here we have this theorist who articulates a materialist conception of history, right, where materialism is historically in its in its treatment in various kind of philosophical contexts associated with determinism, with necessity, right, with that which is very much at odds with mind, spirit, right, the things with which we associate agency and freedom, right? And so then the thought is, well, if Marx is putting forward this materialist conception of history, how can that is somehow accommodating towards these things that we tend to associate with the ideal aspects of being, like mind, right, desires, so on, things of that nature. So it's a real problem for Marx, especially because it's clear that he's not going to take one way out, which is to just say, oh, there is no such thing as agency. Obviously, he cares quite a lot about it, I agree with Leah that the way to think about the whole project is it's a human freedom project, right? That's the kind of central thing at stake. And so this question of, well, is Marx able to accommodate these two things that both seem absolutely central to his theory is of utmost importance, right? It's directly relevant to the question of whether he has anything coherent, right, to tell us. So I think one of the things that has, at least within Anglophone context, certainly, and I think much more broadly than that, one of the things that has stymied attempts to think about freedom and determinism is oftentimes we think about them in ways that are modeled on the sort of question that someone like Descartes was asking, right? Or the sort of questions that occupy the minds of contemporary analytical philosophers. Namely, we think about these two things in rigid opposition, freedom and determinism, and then we ask, we want an answer true for all contexts, circumstances, and all time. In the case of human beings, how much determinism is at play and how much freedom do they have? And we want a kind of static explanation of that. And if we try to put Marx's way of thinking about freedom and determinism, or freedom and necessity, into those terms, then we automatically end up misrepresenting it and misconstruing it. Because part of what's going on for Marx is that he is talking about the relationship between freedom and necessity as a historically developing interaction. So he gives us these accounts of early human beings as living lives that are, by and large, completely dominated by necessity, right? By deterministic laws, in particular by their material need for food, right? For whatever the conditions of the sheer biological survival of mammals of this type are, right? That's the thing that early human beings were after, finding food, finding shelter, finding warmth, and so on, right? And so that direct response to their biological needs and the attempt to satisfy those needs within whatever material context they were in, that absolutely dominates everything about their lives. But as they do this, right, and this is how we turn to a discussion of need for Marx, right? We know that Marx's account of human need is that as we intervene into our environments in order to satisfy our needs, we transform our environments, right? We transform ourselves. And if we transform our environments and ourselves as human beings and as individuals and as a species, then that means that we now have a new set of needs, which in turn, right, we must satisfy, thereby laying down what for Marx is the material basis of an in principle limitless proliferation of all sorts of human needs and human forms of activity and interaction with their natural and social environment aimed at satisfying their needs. As human beings greatly expand the ways that they interact with their environment, right? They figure out tools, they figure out fire, they figure out clothing, right? They have more and more time to develop tastes, right, and preferences. Culture, right, becomes richer and plays its role in determining what kinds of lives people live, what kinds of lives they prefer to live, and what kinds of lives they're able to live, right? And so you have just like this real practical proliferation of ways that human beings can make their subjective preferences part of the objective reality out there in the world, right? Impose their ideas onto material resources, and they're increasingly the kinds of dreams and desires and aspirations they have are more and more unmoored, right, from just the direct satisfaction of biologically necessary needs. And so what we have in Marx, in my book, I talk about this as dialectical compatibilism, which is a term that I coined to describe this way that we have to think about first these kinds of very determined kinds of forms of life where human beings' own preferences have very little impact, right? Aside from the bare preference not to die of starvation, right? So we start there. That's that we do have to understand human beings in that context, but it's human beings themselves in living in those highly determined conditions and engaging in behavior that is initially highly deterministic, right? But it's precisely that deterministic development of human beings and their ways of interacting with the world that then itself in practice gives rise to freedom, understood as a widely expanding array of ways that human beings can choose to exist in the world, based on their inner desires, their preferences, their talents, right? The things that they regard as worth doing and as good and fulfilling ways of spending their time and their efforts and their energy. And it's not just preference satisfaction, but actually being able to be more concretely the authors of their circumstances, which is what's at play in this process that I'm describing, where human beings less and less are just responding to the circumstances they find, and more can exercise agency over transforming those circumstances in the ways that they regard as consistent with their conditions of flourishing, and producing the circumstances that are then going to give them increased agency to direct their own development as human beings. And I see that as the sort of like overarching principle for Marx when we talk about freedom is a question of what is required, what historical processes are necessary so that human beings can truly be authors of themselves. I think when I am doing my work and I take it that to apply the materialist conception of history, one of the things it centrally means is to adopt as a working hypothesis that human life, human existence, human social being is a human product. It is all the consequence, right, of our doing as a species. But that is not fully realized yet, right? And so I think that freedom for Marx means making that process as fully actualized as possible and creating the circumstances within which human beings can exercise agency over producing themselves as a species in the way that they wish to be. And now we're talking about communism, right? Now we're talking about conditions where human beings recognize their conditions of flourishing as the same as the conditions of flourishing for other members of their species, for their fellows, right? We're talking about human beings exercising the kind of control, rational, goal-oriented control over socially necessary resources so that this kind of agency that I'm describing can occur, because it's one thing to be able to dream a dream, and it's another thing to actually have the material resources that allow you to have this kind of agency and control over human existence. Your own, and both on the individual basis and for society, to be able to intervene in its own development in a rational way.
That's great, and I have a question that's really I have two questions for both of you. So let me give them both, and you can choose which one you want. But this one, I was thinking, Vanessa, maybe of you first in this, but yeah, these both questions have to do with my own limitations, and so I'm asking both of you to help me, maybe, which is that both of you are quite comfortable posing these questions in terms of ethics and morality. And partly I think that's related when each of you are talking to the notion of the human and of a certain humanism here. I have an allergy to morality and ethics both, because for me at least the standard discourses, of course, and many things go under these terms with different authors, come back to individual choices and reinforcing the individual as the unit of action and of decision and of thought, etc. And so I'm much more comfortable thinking of these questions in what I consider political terms rather than moral or ethical terms. So that's one thing that I don't even know if there's a way of telling me, Michael, you've got it all wrong, or how to figure, and if ethics or morality works differently for you. So that's one. So you could also ignore that one, because my other one is that in the whole discussion about freedom, also freedom is a difficult concept for me. And I'm much more inclined to think in terms of liberation. And even in the distinction between liberation and emancipation, which I take to be, the simple version is that I see emancipation as the removal of chains, but not a transformation of the subjects who were enchained, that they are emancipated from their chains. Whereas I see liberation as the transformation also of the subject who was enslaved or etc. previously. But in each case, both of them I think I see as processes that of course don't end or realized. I mean, I see, so anyway, that partly might be why I'm trying to reflect why I myself don't use freedom, but instead do often focus on liberation. And I guess if I'm wondering if those resonate with you. So these are totally different questions. The first one has more to do, I think, with your own philosophical bases and references and even a technical misunderstanding. The second one actually might be more substantially political about how we think about freedom in relationship to, or maybe you mean the same thing and I'm just using different terms. Okay. Why don't you start, if you have a way, Vanessa, with these, a way of engaging, see what.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll actually start with the first question, but I'll make my way to the second. So I think, so I made a sort of joke, that it was totally fair to be skeptical about an ethical or moral perspective in Marx, but I mean that. There's copious good reason to be highly skeptical of it. Maybe chief among those reasons, the fact that Marx absolutely blisteringly excoriates every moral theory that he ever comes in contact with throughout the course of his writings. Marx is extremely mocking about morality in the Communist Manifesto, and Marx says again and again that the communists do not preach morality. So those are all extremely good reasons to be highly skeptical of it. I think especially I'll focus on Marx's argument that the communists do not preach morality. And I think that one of the reasons, and this ties into your point about individualism and the addressee of moral injunctions, right? I think when Marx and Engels say that the communists do not preach morality, well, first of all, I guess they don't preach to anybody, but they do talk to people. And who is it that they're talking to? And one of the things that distinguishes them from other theorists in their milieu is that they're definitely not talking to the people in power. They're talking to disempowered people. They're talking to working people, right? And so therefore the communists have no need to preach morality because, in my view, anyway, the entire content of morality on a Marxist theory is proletarian revolution. Is emancipation, right? Whatever kinds of terms we want to use for this, is the liberation of working people. And so therefore they don't have to preach morality to the people with whom they are in conversation. They can just put their whatever might have a kind of normative, injunctive sort of content, they can express it entirely in terms of the economic, political, and social interests of the working class. And this is part of what is transformational about Marx's approach to morality, because it doesn't have to remain a merely ethical phrase for him. It doesn't have to remain something that involves a kind of sacrifice of oneself for society. Another of my favorite passages in Marx, there he's referring, this is in his treatment of Max Stirner, which makes up part of the documents that are compiled into the Critique of the German Ideology. Marx says, well, Stirner thinks that the communists want to sacrifice for society. No, we want to sacrifice society to ourselves, right? We want to sacrifice this existing, unjust is a question-begging term here, but we want to sacrifice, this existing destructive, inhumane, irrational society with its death drive to the needs of humanity, right? Sorry, things are happening on the screen a little bit. So with that being said, then the question is, well, why think about things in an ethical way, right? Or why, if Marx is arguing explicitly that it's unnecessary, and I think that the fact of the matter is that we still live in class society. Obviously, we live amongst these contradictions. We live among these various oppositions. And if it's true that the content of a kind of Marxist ethical perspective, really is coincident with a theory of proletarian revolution, that seems to me like more, not less, reason to be interested in what it looks like to think about these things from through an ethical lens. I think especially Marx wrote so much constantly, all throughout his career, criticizing various kinds of ethical perspectives. I think it's very hard to make sense of that if we're too dismissive and too quick about sweeping aside the question of what then is a Marxist perspective on ethics, because he could have easily said ethics sucks, and then not spent all that time writing about Bentham and J.S. Mill and Kant and Malthus, right, and all the various ways that he engaged with ethical reasoning. Max Stirner, that whole thing against Stirner is just a 400-page argument against ethical egoism, right? So that being said, this question of, addressing himself to a class and not primarily to, the kind of like advice to individuals, right, that morality often provides, I think that's really salient and really necessary in order to understand what's going on with Marx with respect to ethics. That being said, Marx, I won't say the way I read Marx. I'll say this as an objective truth, which is that consistently throughout his writing, Marx again and again and again criticizes capitalism on the basis of its complete inability to promote the development of individuals and their ability to flourish as individuals, and again recommends communism on precisely that basis, right? And so, I don't know how we're doing on time. I won't go into a whole discussion of individualism and individuality in Marx, but I think similar to what we've said already about freedom, Marx has a very robust critique of bourgeois individualism or capitalist individualism, and then what it means to recognize human, of course we're individuals, right? And this is, and we have constituted ourselves as individuals exactly through the process that I described a moment ago, right? This is why Marx talks about human beings transforming themselves from herd animals, right, to individuals. The more ways we can choose from amongst ways to be, ways to do our hair, ways to write, ways to make music, the more that we constitute ourselves as individuals. And I think, I actually think that's just freedom under another description, in fact.
Yeah, I can't really add a lot to that because I think I agree. Said, I guess I only want maybe one line on your concern with liberation and emancipation. So I think of liberation and emancipation as collective categories that have to do with the collective process of search for freedom, but I don't see them as antithetical to freedom. To me, freedom is the kind of motivating ideal, and then liberation and emancipation are the kind of historically situated ways of understanding social struggles that are all struggles for freedom in a way. So I don't see the contrast. The one thing I was going to say, just to add something non-Marxist, but kind of connected to Marx, to what Vanessa was saying, I feel like this decision about, what kind of Marxism to endorse, whether a moral Marxism or a different kind of Marxism, is somehow made when you read like The Republic, and you have this debate between Socrates and Thrasymachos on the sources of power. And Thrasymachos basically says, look, all power is ideology, all power is what the powerful make you believe. And Socrates says, no, there is a kind of source of power that is reasons. And I happen to think that the Marxian tradition is much more compatible with that way of thinking about power than the one that says, all power is ideology. And of course, politics is power, but there is a justification for power. And I think the one that Marx wants to reject is exactly the power of the powerful. He wants to appeal to a source of power that is something that can be justified to human beings as human beings, not as, either bourgeois or as proletarians. And when he, in the early writings, espouses the kind of cause of the working classes, he says, well, this is because this is the cause of the human beings, of the kind of human species as a whole. And so there is a kind of universal drive to the emancipation of the working class, which is exactly what makes the working class a universal class, as he puts it. So I think this is just a kind of little coda to what Vanessa was saying. I can completely agree with her.
If I can jump back in, I just want to say how glad I am that you said that, and I absolutely agree. And these are exactly the kinds of considerations that first got me set off on trying to understand what is a Marxist perspective on ethics, because I think sometimes Marxism is wrongly thought of as just a kind of set of instructions for how the proletariat can come to power. And, you know, if it were just that, that's quite impressive. That would be great. But it is much more than that. I mean, Marx and Engels purport to be producing a science, right, of history. And I think that the considerations you just raised are exactly what makes that a plausible way, right, to think about what it is that they're doing, because they really are attempting to articulate objective, universal aims that they see as already inherent in human agency, right? And they're describing that and also attempting to articulate what is necessary in order to allow that to flourish and develop.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I was just finding myself, I think I agree exactly when you said, Leah, that you see liberation as a collection of as a collective project. There you go. And I guess maybe what the distinction, I'm trying to reason through how my own terminological preferences here, or conceptual, that liberation for me is a matter of focusing and struggling against structures of social unfreedom, or structures of social domination. Whereas freedom can sometimes, and this is what I'm trying to work through here, freedom can sometimes be used to think not structurally, but in terms of individuals. And I think that's where my conceptual preferences lie. I'm also less concerned with the human as a base point than the two of you are. Mm-hmm. That's a separate discussion. I had a slightly different question that might shift gears that I wanted to ask you to, which is about, in my view, at least, there are a number of projects that are focused on freedom or freedom and liberation in the last few decades. In different, somewhat slightly different traditions. I was thinking of Linda Zerilli's book about F for Freedom, I believe it's called. In terms of that feminist theory needs to come back to a question about freedom and liberation within Black studies and Black politics. I was thinking about Fred Moten in this regard, making a similar insistence in The Break, and many other authors. So I guess I'm partly thinking about how the two of you, if there are links in which you see your interest in freedom fitting within contemporary traditions. Like the contemporary literature authors and the ways that we should put it. And going along with that, I guess this was Philip's question from earlier, which is whether the concept for freedom works with or poses a difference for you with other concepts that might function in allied terms like justice or democracy. Like, why is it that freedom and or liberation, I'm imposing myself, I'm sorry, might be the key terms rather than democracy or justice as the key terms? So I mean, that I don't know if that's really two separate questions. Like one is about other projects that you feel close to, but maybe with them, why is it this term? Why is it freedom rather than justice, democracy? Now I'm just ventriloquizing for Philip, but I think I'm doing it accurately. Okay, whichever of you are. Leah, you're unmuted, so maybe you should start.
Okay, great. So I think maybe I'll start at the very end. I see freedom as connected to justice and democracy. Actually, I just see freedom as the foundation of both of these things. So for me, democracy is one particular way of realizing freedom at a collective level, where I start with this kind of very Kantian, and justice to some extent is connected to this idea of democracy in the same way. I start with this very Rousseauian kind of Kantian idea, which is that in society, we want to have freedom, and we want to have a kind of freedom that brings together the individual and the collective in the right way. And I think democracy is the type of rule that enables people to achieve just that. And of course, it's not democracy in the way in which, you know, it's often impoverished, the way the term it's impoverished, because I don't think liberal, or what goes as liberal democracy, is actually real democracy, because it's kind of bounded by dimensions of, you know, state belonging, or by forms of constraints of political power, by economic power. But to me, democracy is a very important idea of political rule, precisely because it is connected to freedom, because it's the kind of system in which, you know, as Rousseau says, we all make rules together by being as free as we were without being before we were in society, something like that. So basically, I think these are, both democracy and justice are institutional forms of realizing this foundational ideal, which is freedom at the end. And I think on your first, I guess your first concern, which is that you say freedom is not used to think structurally, but with individuals in mind. I mean, first of all, I would say that even if you only have individuals in mind, capitalism is a kind of system that actually fails individuals. It only favors some individuals, but fails most individuals, and on a global scale. And this is also partly why I think freedom was actually really important in a certain kind of anti-colonial Marxist tradition, because they start precisely with this emancipatory idea, which is, look, we want to take freedom seriously. We want to take freedom that you take seriously. It's just that you're not doing it. And I think this is really important discursively to challenge the liberals, to say, look, I care about the same thing as you do. It's just that the economic system that you have built up doesn't enable you to realize your very own ideals. And so it develops a kind of immanent critique of capitalism that shows you how socialism is a necessity by starting with that immanent critique. And I think that's a very powerful tool. And so it's powerful because, you know, even if you just worry about the individuals, you better worry about all individuals everywhere in the world, not just some individuals in some parts of the world. And then because with this idea of freedom, I think you can also build in a concern with social structures that goes just beyond the types of unfreedom that liberals have in mind when they think about unfreedom, when they think about oppression. You know, a state that, for example, circumscribes freedom, or a state that kind of prevents people from having freedom of speech, freedom of association, but that don't see hunger as a kind of also equally fundamental form of unfreedom. And I think that enables you to expand the range rather than restrict it. And I think it's actually part of what makes great the socialist tradition in a way, is that it can take on the liberals precisely on the thing that is most concerning to them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I'll say is I don't know that on my view, I necessarily think of freedom as the central concept, although it's certainly a central concept. And as I was thinking about how to answer your question, I was like, do I have one central concept that I would put at the heart of my articulation, right, of a Marxist perspective, of a socialist perspective? I think for me that word would actually be labor. In, you know, I don't know, like unreconstructed communist sense or whatever, but I think labor is the word that I would put at the center. The reason being that when we think from the perspective of labor, we're already thinking about activity, agency, and production, and hopefully the circumstances within those processes occur and unfold. And I think that it is by looking at the world from the perspective of labor, and that is to say, from the perspective of already ongoing active intervention and interaction with our natural and social environments in order to achieve an aim. I think that starting from that perspective is precisely what allows us, for example, to have a better understanding of what freedom is, where it comes from, what thwarts it, what the conditions of its manifestation might be. So yeah, I would certainly labor would be my answer. And yeah, and to say a little bit more about this question of individualism or of individuals and society. I mean, one of the, there's a number of like really curious things that Marx says. One of them is right in the manifesto, where he explains that in order to have real freedom, it would be necessary for the proletariat to make, he says, despotic inroads on private property, right? Why usually like despots don't go around saying, I'm going to despot today. So why does he use that word? And he's being ironic, as he often is, but he also means it. Because the kinds of interventions that the masses of society are going to have to make are ones that are unjustifiable from the perspective of private property. We're not going to be able to borrow any of the moral language or priorities or what liberal morality regards as an absolutely inviolable right. None of that are we going to be able to invoke to justify the seizure of fuel resources, right? Of the land that's necessary for people to have places to live and so on, right? In other places too, Marx talks about the role of unions, and he talks about the sort of freedom of the contract of the individual to meet another individual on a theoretically, abstractly equal basis and make their own free decisions about what to agree to. And this is precisely what is prevented by union contract, right? Because the worker cannot just in those cases agree to whatever they feel like, right? They're bound by this contract that's arbitrated by the union. And when you look at sort of like union busting materials that come from corporations, this is precisely what they usually go to. They say, look at how these unions want to prevent your freedoms. You have this freedom to agree to any contract you want, and it's God-given and inviolable, and it's the basis, of course, of liberal political life, and these unions want to take it away. And Marx describes this as one of the ways in which, if we think about these things dialectically and the way that a thing can contain its own opposite, in this case, workers organizing together to limit one type of freedom is the thing that actually allows for the what we call it real, the more robust, the more human, the freedom of being able to actually exert real control over their circumstances of employment, as opposed to the illusory control, right, of the individual non-collectively negotiated contract, right? And so there's all kinds of ways where in practice, embracing, one kind of limitation on the so-called freedoms that are guaranteed in liberal society is what actually allows the conditions for human beings to have real authority and agency over their lives, over their conditions of work, right? And I think that's just one of the ways in which he offers a really complex, right, and rich way of thinking about this relationship between individual and society, and what it means to reconcile that seeming contradiction, rather than just trying to sort of manage it in the way that liberal societies do.
I am looking to try to respect our time of things, and I was wondering if maybe we should wrap up here, and if you had accumulated last things you wanted to be sure to get to I wanted to give either of you time to come back to topics or yeah, I don't know, clarify things that I misunderstood, that sort of thing. Do you have, Leah, do you have, are there some things accumulated that you wanted to be sure to get to, or?
No, it's fine.
No, okay.
I feel satisfied with the discussion, which was
No, I'm very
really
pleased
lovely. Yeah.
Vanessa and I don't disagree enough. So it's kind of...
I know, right?
I'm playing the role of that. Yes, Philip, I can see that Philip just rejoined us. So Philip, I can pass to you.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for a fascinating discussion and a prelude to 4 more days of fascinating discussions. And before I let the viewers go, I'd like to clue you in as to what we have coming up. This afternoon at 3 p.m., What Was Neoliberalism with Sarah Bruyette, Nikhil Pal Singh, Joshua Clover, and Jamie Merchant. Tomorrow, Saturday at 11 a.m., Uno Kozo's Theory of Crisis Today with Richard Westra, Ken Kawashima, Wendy Matsumura, and Gavin Walker. On Sunday at 11 a.m., There's No Such Thing as the Economy with Samuel Chambers, Cordelia Belton, and Edward, the hosts of Real Abstraction, and Soren Mao, who has a wonderful book on mute compulsion, which describes capitalism. Those of you who read Pistone will, of course, understand that. On Monday at 11 a.m., our final panel for this year is presented in a partnership with Spectre Journal. If you don't subscribe, you should. Vanessa is on the editorial board of that wonderful magazine, as are people like Charlie Post, David McNally, Zach Levinson, and a number of Holly Lewis, and lots of very good people. Anyway, Spectre is presenting with us a panel called Ukraine, Imperialism and the World Economy, with Ilya Matveev, Rebecca Karl, David McNally, and Yulia Yurchenko from the Ukraine. She's the author of a book called Ukraine and the Empire of Capital from Pluto Press, which is a wonderful political economy of the conflict there. So great stuff coming up. And if you're in Seattle on Tuesday, you can see the last of our 6 movies from Miklos Janško, Electra, My Love, at the Beacon Cinema at 7:30 p.m. Contributions, we need to stage the 7th Red May next year. So go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and hit the donate button. You can be a Patreon, a patron, or go to our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, and be generous. Thank you very much, and we'll see you later. And thanks once again to all our panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.